Hey, hello, happy Friday. We are, as you can see, not in front of the white wall today. And admittedly, I maybe have forgotten how to set up a shot over here. Maybe I never knew to begin with, but I guess I'm just asking for a little grace period if things don't look perfect. As if they've ever looked anything close to perfect. I am well aware they have not. But today we need to return to the world of the Hell's Bells with Sarah MacLean's new title, Knockout. We, of course, have talked about Bombshell and Heartbreaker previously, so if you haven't caught those discussions or want to refresh, feel free to go back. I did. But today we are talking about Knockout by Sarah MacLean, which is the third in the Hell's Bells series. I almost said trilogy, but it's not. There are four, and it is the highly anticipated book for Tommy and Imogen that has been 2 to 3 years in the making for us as readers now. Math should be my strong suit, and yet here we are. Is this the platonic ideal of a Sarah MacLean novel? Maybe. But before we jump all the way in, I'm going to switch gears for just a quick second if you'll indulge me, and if you won't, you don't really get a choice in the matter, sorry. And I want to wish a very happy birthday to my parents. Yes, my parents do in fact have the same birthday. I feel like I have mentioned this before because when I was little, I thought that was how you knew who you were supposed to marry before I went to daycare and found out that one of the girls at daycare had the same birthday as me, and I didn't think she was super nice to me. So then I started kind of thinking about that theory just a little bit deeper and decided to throw it out the window. But irregardless, it is in fact my parents' birthday. So if you want to join me in wishing them both a very happy birthday. And now to get back to the main event, Tommy and Imogen. Hashtag Tommy Goes Boom. If you have been with this series previously, you know that these two have gotten a lot of page space. They have taken up a lot of space on the page since they were introduced. They're big characters, they're big personalities, and they are fun and propulsive to watch in scenes together. So we've seen them dancing around each other since Bombshell. And in last year's release, Heartbreaker, we got a whole epilogue that was basically just them, setting up them and their book. They are fan favorites. And so I was very much anticipating this book, absolutely. And it's very interesting because especially with a book series of 4 for Sarah MacLean, it is usually the last book that is like the big one. I mean, even in her trilogies, there's this idea that we're teasing something toward the end, which we absolutely still are here, and we will touch on. But even amidst that, this was a couple that readers were thirsting for. And so I also found it very interesting because we kind of upset the normal structure at the end of Heartbreaker with Tommy and Imogen. They kind of defy the rules. And then after I went back and kind of revisited my thoughts on Bombshell and Heartbreaker, I was reminded that both of those books, in their prologues, are kind of establishing our heroines within the context of the Hell's Bells. It's showing them being brought into the group. And we don't get that from Imogen's book. We are still at the beginning very much establishing her within the group, but we're not necessarily seeing her origin story there. And I do think that that speaks to her character a little bit in some ways. She's constantly pushing forward. She's a little bit larger than life in so many ways. And there's a vulnerability to her in that we don't really see until we see her playing with Tommy later in the book. But along with that, if you have been following this series, you know that Imogen is our explosives expert. And so I have been very interested since the title of this book was announced that it was titled Knockout. But if you'll indulge me in like zooming in on the minutia for a second here again with the name, because again, Imogen is our explosives expert, so it makes sense, or you would assume that there would be some pun or play on words in relation to explosions within the title itself, and yet we get Knockout, which is more indicative of fighting. And at first, I kind of was unsure about it. I'm not gonna lie. It just didn't seem to make sense. But then when thinking about these characters, having read the book, I think it does make sense because while we do obviously have a lot of explosions in this book and the onomatopoeias that accompany them in a myriad of ways, I think it speaks to something a little bit more visceral and a little bit more physical with the term knockout, because it implies that both of these characters are being physically impacted by this relationship, by this attraction, by this kind of dance that they're doing in some way, and it's knocking them on their butt. There is a physical consequence to this, and so it carries a little bit more weight in that, I think, because we have seen the lead up for the last 2 years, at least for us as readers, and 14 months for these characters, which is really well established within the narrative itself. Even if we haven't been following along, the narrative tells us it has been 14 months, and we get the impression, we're told very bluntly by Tommy in his perspective, that his life has been irrevocably changed by the introduction of Imogen, since she, and admittedly the other Hell's Bells, stepped into his life. And so at the beginning of the book, they are investigating an explosion of what seems to be a seamstress's shop, but has a dual purpose, and this idea that there have been a string of explosions targeting places that are fighting for women and women's rights in some way. And so the Bells are looking into this, obviously, because they are our vigilante girl group. They are fighting for the women of the city. And then Tommy turns up pretty close on their heels. He is also on the trail of these explosions as a detective inspector, the head of the detective investigation unit at Scotland Yard. I admittedly do not know a whole lot about the historical hierarchies of police structures in England. However, his position here and the power that comes along with it, along with the fact that he has another promotion being kind of dangled in front of him, or is something he is working toward, is a huge crux of the book. And this idea that has been explored throughout the entire series about what structures of power look like, who holds power, how that power is undermined in certain ways. It's really an interesting exploration, because here we have Tommy, who as a hero does not believe he is good enough for Imogen, in the sense that she is higher than him socially, she is born to a title, and he thinks that he is beneath her. Also, he's just very much attracted to her and thinks that she is too good for him because of that as well. And so there is the power that Imogen seemingly holds because of that position of power, but then the exploration of how that is complicated by both her gender and her interest in science, how that makes her kind of an oddball within these circles. People don't take her seriously because of it, even though she's incredibly intelligent and she holds all of this power in other circles where that power is limited based on the room that she's in. And we see this with Tommy as well. He's at the height of power in this investigative unit at Scotland Yard, but we see the way that he doesn't hold power within places like the ballroom. And we are reintroduced to ballrooms here after taking a break in the last book. So they're both on the search for whoever is behind these explosions. And Tommy knows that Imogen and the Bells have more information than they are letting on to him. They're not letting him in to their side of the investigation because they don't know if they can trust him. Even as Imogen really acknowledges her attraction to him and that she thinks he's a good guy, she also recognizes, and the Bells recognize and articulate, that he is part of a power structure that they don't know that they can trust, especially as evidence they are getting start pointing to some collusion with Scotland Yard in these explosions. And so she is trying to figure out what is going on. Meanwhile, she is caught out in this investigation. It's reported back to her brother, and her brother, who is the owner of the title and doesn't really understand his sister, doesn't really know what to do with her, decides that it is time for her to get married. Imogen definitely doesn't want that and decides it's time to leave her brother's house. So she basically kind of runs away. And so Scotland Yard is brought in to kind of help find her. And while Tommy is kind of charged with this because he pays very close attention to Imogen, he's like, she's not missing, she's at the place, and finds her immediately. And so she agrees to go back to her brother, not because she's decided it is time for her to get married, but because she and the Bells have decided it may benefit their investigation to be in close proximity to all of these suitors, to know who is funding Scotland Yard in these explosions, or at least a contingent of Scotland Yard, because they have pretty solid evidence that places members of Scotland Yard at the scene of the crime. Meanwhile, in the course of their interactions, there have been a couple of moments where Imogen's life has been put at risk. One of the moments where she's cited early is Tommy literally carrying her from a crumbling building after this explosion because he is trying to investigate. She goes to run back and save him because she knows the building is gonna fall because, again, she is an expert, and he ends up carrying her out. And then later he pushes her to save her from a runaway carriage. And so he has decided that she must be protected, and he basically presents himself as a bodyguard. So while when I read the blurb, I wasn't really anticipating the bodyguard angle. One, it wasn't as central in like the ultimate plot as it seemed like it was going to be, and two, it was delicious in that it was basically wholly instigated by Tommy, because Tommy is one of those absolutely gone for his love interest heroes who basically will growl at anyone who threatens Imogen, and there is this overprotectiveness there, but it's because he fully sees and appreciates Imogen and doesn't like when other people don't. And so a lot of the time it's people kind of bad-mouthing her and him getting upset because people aren't respecting her, which is incredibly attractive, and she is just as attracted to him. She is very aware of his thick thighs, and so we have this couple that has this really palpable sexual tension. The attraction is there from the absolute beginning of this book. So you might be like, okay, Melody, what is keeping them apart? Does it feel contrived? It does admittedly go back mostly to Tommy's kind of belief that Imogen is better than him and that they are not on the same playing field, and basically that he can't marry her, or more importantly, she can't marry him. It's part of the Sarah McLean trademarked hero emotional constipation, and that might read as frustrating because you might be like, why aren't they having this conversation? But here's the thing, they do. And so you've got this kind of insurmountable thing that they keep talking around, and I want to go back to those conversations a little bit, but then we also have the external conflict of it. This idea of, again, Imogen doesn't know the full picture. At first she believes she can trust Tommy, but she's not absolutely certain, and she's not going to put the lives of women across the city at risk because of her attraction. And Tommy believes he's keeping Imogen safe by not giving in to this impulse, to this attraction, and not just attraction, because they really see each other. And when we talked about Heartbreaker, I talked a lot about how Adelaide really resonated with me because she was so afraid to speak what she wanted. She was afraid to name it because if she named it and she didn't get it, that heartbreak would be too much for her, which really spoke to me. And here we have almost the inverse. Imogen is not afraid to ask for what she wants or to declare what she wants, but then has to deal with this idea of being too much in whatever that means within the societal context of this, or even just how she feels she moves about the world and how others react to her, whether it be her personality or even her body. Though Imogen as a plus-size love interest in this, and the way that particularly Tommy describes her, meant so much to me. This idea of him kind of reveling in her softness, the way that just the roundness of her face was described so lovingly. As someone who has always had a very round face, I didn't know how much that would mean to me to hear it described so lovingly, but it did. But nonetheless, going back to this idea of Imogen asking for things, now we're going to move in to the portion where I'm going to read you some of my favorite quotes, because I think McLean's language, her building of tension, the way she explores these characters, she's so good at building out these internal and external worlds in a way that really develops these characters and these relationships, and that makes the emotional bits just resonate so much more. So speaking of resonated, this is one of Imogen's quotes that just really hit me personally. I am tired of asking for people to love me. Just once, I'd like someone to love me freely in all my truth without my having to ask for it. So with Adelaide, we have a heroine who is afraid to ask for the thing she wants, who her journey is about being able to name and claim. And with Imogen, we have a heroine who is not afraid to use her words, who proudly and boldly declares what she wants, but she wants to be chosen back. She wants to be enough. So a lot of the tension and the runaround between Imogen and Tommy really goes back to this idea of what they each want and what they believe is the best for the other, particularly in Tommy's case, and what the best for the other actually is. And while it would be easy to classify Tommy's behavior as controlling or overbearing in terms of deciding what Imogen wants, it's also rooted in this deep insecurity because he doesn't ultimately believe he's enough, and he's trying to make the world better in the ways that he thinks he can within the systems that he has tried to move up, yet he is always very aware of his position, especially when he steps into places like these ballrooms. When he steps into Imogen's world, he doesn't feel comfortable there. He doesn't feel like he fits in. So both of them are very much outsiders in this world, in society, and they ultimately find that place of belonging and that place of comfort with the other. And then there are just two more quotes, particularly about Imogen, or that I think reveal something about Imogen, that I want to read just because I liked them and I can do what I want. So the first one is, "Perhaps I do hide in my chaos, in my movement, but more and more I find there is no time for stillness." And so this is just kind of like exploring how Imogen moves through the world, and this idea that she is such a kind of ball of chaos in some ways. And so she is Tommy's inciting incident. She is what upsets his natural order, his world. And in many ways, he is the same for her, but it's a much different kind of energy. And the way their energies bounce off each other is part of the delight of their relationship, because it's not necessarily a hate to love dynamic. It's not necessarily like a chase like in the last book, but it is a little bit cat and mouse. Imogen is definitely playing with him in some ways, but she wants him to return that energy, wants him to throw it right back at her, wants to get under his skin. And so while Imogen is this outgoing, sunshiny, chaotic, good force of a human, she still has insecurities. And the way that they kind of mirror Tommy's insecurities in many ways, even before they realize that, but this next quote kind of speaks to that. "That was the problem with her, wasn't it? She wasn't the kind of woman any man would choose, which was how she'd landed in this place, with a brother who couldn't stomach her, searching for a man who would suffer her, all while this man, this perfect, glorious man whom she couldn't stop looking at or thinking of or talking to, regretted her." And the word choice there, regret, I think that speaks to something so raw and vulnerable. This fear of not only not being wanted, and this facade almost that she's put up to kind of hide that vulnerability, whether she realizes it or not, and even as it aligns with who she is inherently. It's not about just being too much, not being wanted, not being chosen. It's the idea that she could reach out for something, she could have something within her grasp, and ultimately she would be a regret. And maybe I'm just reading too much into it. Maybe I'm finding the little pieces of Imogen here, just like I found the little pieces of Adelaide before, that really resonate. But I think that that is one of the most impactful things about Sarah MacLean books, is the way that she's able to build these lush, involved characters. So then amidst these fully formed people that may not reflect us, I am not an Imogen. I'm just not. But I still find those kernels of me in Imogen. And because she builds such specific worlds, specific characters, we're able to still find kernels of ourselves in those worlds and in the characters. And I just think it's absolutely glorious. I think this book had a lot to live up to, and I was kind of nervous about it because of that. And I think that the balance of the internal and external conflict here really works. I think it forwarded Imogen and Tommy's story. And I think it was really fun watching these characters that admittedly take up most of the space in the room when on the page with others, really got to play within their own space here, and we got to discover them even more and deepen them. And so as we transition out of Imogen and Tommy, we are of course looking to Duchess's book for next. And as I've mentioned before, even tonight, generally the finale in a Sarah MacLean series is kind of the cherry on top. It's something that we have been waiting for. And because of that, me and my friend Kelsey, who I've mentioned before, we've been talking for years at this point about who Duchess may be, because we have been convinced that we have encountered Duchess in the Sarah MacLean universe before. After the reveal at the end of this book, I am not sure if I still think that. Kelsey thinks yes, and honestly, I probably should still trust her instincts, but I do just want to appreciate this ending for a second. I'm not going to spoil anything. However, I have been anticipating this for years as well, because the tease of a last book of a Sarah MacLean novel is the moment in a lot of cases, and the mystery around Duchess and the reveal of that has clearly been at the center of the setup for this last book. And so I was anticipating a certain kind of tease at the end of this book, and we did not get the kind of tease I was anticipating. We got something genius, and probably doubly genius, just because it defied my expectations so brilliantly. But now I'm also still in this moment of basically where I've been the last 2 years of who is Duchess? And I think that is going to be the central question of the last book. I also think that all of these previous books have done a really good job of having really high external stakes within their book, but we also have this kind of building momentum for the last book. We've got the kind of final boss coming up, right? There's this sense that we are really taking on an enemy at the end of this, and that Duchess is the kind of larger than life character that is going to tackle that. But she's also still so much of a secret, still so much of an enigma. And in many ways, I think her reveal, at least for me as a reader, is kind of living in the reveal at the end of the Rules of Scoundrels series, which I reread last year, and the very beginning of this year, I read Chase's book, and just remembering how delicious and how satisfying that reveal was and the end of that series was. I remember when my romance book club saw Sarah MacLean speak at Printers Row last year, this time last year, I mentioned to her that we were reading that series and that I was very much anticipating the reactions of my fellow book club members who had not read it before to that twist. And she said something along the lines of, that's not a secret anymore. That's kind of like open source knowledge in the romance reading community. But to my friends, it was still a secret, and getting to experience that again for the first time was just phenomenal. But also then seeing the seeds that had been planted that I maybe didn't pick up on the first time was phenomenal. So I'm thinking now with this series, what am I going to look back on in retrospect and go, it was so obvious. So very interested to get to the bottom of Duchess. And in light of the end of the Rules of Scoundrels series, do we think that we've met Duchess before? Because there was a very specific twist there that will we see it repeated similarly here? I don't know, but I am very, very interested in Duchess's story. We of course have another year wait because while publishing is working on expediting that romance timeline in a way that makes me very nervous, this is still on a 1 release a year schedule. So we'll just plan to meet back this time next year to talk about Duchess. But in the meantime, I am so eager to hear your thoughts about Tommy and Imogen. I know, as usual, I barely grazed the surface here. I didn't even talk about how this had one of my favorite tropes, weather-induced intimacy. And if you know, you do know. So let me know what you were thinking. Thanks as always for hanging out and listening to my thoughts. Read something good, and yeah, bye.